Thank you for being with us, Manolo.
A pleasure to be with you.
You are in touch with social movements there in the U.S. Tell us, what has been the reaction from groups on the events today?
Well, we have felt very strongly since this morning when we woke up to the news of another coup attempt. We understand very clearly what coups mean. Many of us are exiles who've come from Latin America as a result of the violence and bloodshed and the dictatorships that usually follow coup attempts like this in Latin America. So we woke up to a lot of concern, and that's why we immediately mobilized and actually created a press conference here in New York of different religious and community leaders who felt this concern, but felt it was very important to actually engage in the battle of ideas that is taking place here. Because while the coup has failed on the ground and the people of Venezuela has successfully defeated it, we still feel concerned about how the US government, the Trump administration, continues to make statements supporting these acts of violence that occurred this morning and continue to support people like Guaido who only bring more violence to the people of Venezuela. This is nothing more than an act of imperialist aggression that we as people in the United States cannot stand behind.
Manolo, you've held a number of events at the People's Forum there in New York, and you were even joined by the Foreign Minister Jorge Arraza last week. Tell us what that was like.
Well, for us, it's always a pleasure welcoming not just Jorge Arraza, but other Venezuelan diplomats, because we feel it's important to give them a space to speak. Usually on the media here in the United States, as in many parts of the world, the only side of the story that is ever listened to is that of the White House and their allies. We actually feel it's very important to hear the perspectives, the analysis coming from the Venezuelan people and their government. And having Jorge Arraza here as foreign minister speak, he actually shed light on something that most Americans don't hear or understand, which is the fact that, yes, there is an economic crisis in Venezuela, but that the weight of this economic crisis comes from the immense sanctions that the US government has placed. And there is still yet more to be known about the sanctions, but just from what the basic information that the foreign minister shared with us, we understood that this was a grave situation and that people in the US definitely needed to act immediately and urgently, because we're talking about the lives of innocent human beings who are right now heavily suffering from this aggression from the United States for the only crime of wanting to build an alternative society, of wanting to uphold their democracy. And we want to support all these efforts. And we will continue to invite people from Venezuela to speak here at our forum. We consider it to be highly important for people to hear that side of the story as well.
Manolo, you mentioned that you have Latin American roots, actually from a Cuban background. Can you talk to us a little about the history of the U.S. in Latin America?
Well, I was born in the Dominican Republic, but I consider myself from the Caribbean. And knowing from that background, you know, my country in the Dominican Republic, one of the reasons my parents had to leave my country and leave to travel to other countries like Cuba and the United States and other parts of the world is because of the US interference in our democracy. In 1963, we suffered a US-backed coup, which then resulted in over thousands of people being arrested and tortured, many hundreds of people being disappeared. So we know exactly what these coups means. And when we know that the United States government is behind it, when people like Trump, Bolton, and Mike Pence declare their loving support for a violent coup taking place in any part of the world, we know very clearly what that means. And we reject it with all our strength and with all our love, because we, again, want to support a situation in which there is peace for the Venezuelan people. And that can only happen if there is dialogue. And for the last few years, the one country that has successfully blocked all efforts for peace and dialogue has been the United States government.
Manolo, lastly, can you tell us about some of the mobilizations that have taken place around the embassy in New York and where you are, and why is this so important?
Well, you know, we were also very saddened and actually ashamed when very recently the United States government basically handed diplomatic property, the property of the Venezuelan people, their consulate here in New York, basically handed it to figures of the opposition who have no legitimacy, who have no recognition in most parts of the world. And we felt the need to actually go rally at the consulate and defend it and actually tell the world that they have broken all international conventions and even just the basic rights that any embassy or any diplomatic facility is afforded in the United States. And we rejected it wholeheartedly. And we will continue to mobilize because, again, there's an important side of this story that is not being shared, sadly, in the media in the United States and is not being shared among so many peace loving people in the United States. And is that the Venezuelan people are here struggling for their democracy. And if we love peace and if we stand for democracy, we have to stand with the Venezuelan people at this moment.